Back in chapter 124, Rama asked, how was it that though the fourfold Vipascit was but one person with a single consciousness, the four of them entertained different desires? King Vipascit split into four, became four separate beings. So his consciousness split into four. But actually, it didn't split into four. It split into several billion. Because it's the same consciousness that is in you, as is in me, as is in everybody else. And it didn't really split at all, of course. If we think it's split up, it's like saying space is split up. But as far as we know, space is seamless. We don't get gaps of no space. Although maybe the quantum physicists have got such a thing. But let's just take space in the usual common sense point of view. So if I said there was no space between me and you, I occupy space, you occupy space, and there's a big gap in between us where there was no space, well, that would be absurd, wouldn't it? We understand space as homogeneous. There's no holes or breaks in it. We inhabit the same space. In the same way, we inhabit the same consciousness. This is difficult to understand until you actually realize the nature of your own consciousness. You realize that your consciousness is uncoloured by who you think you are, by what you think the world is. So liberation means realizing the nature of your own consciousness and realizing its infinite potential, realizing its infinite nature. And it's when we read stories or hear descriptions about the nature of this consciousness that the limited mind sometimes understands it in terms of psychic powers. Nothing is impossible for this consciousness. The consciousness of Vipascit had become awakened, but it had not attained the supreme state. Hence, though it is one, it manifests as the all everywhere. This is the nature of consciousness. It manifests as everything. It is what is. In a state in which there is both awakening and non-awakening, all these things are possible. When the supreme truth has not been attained, such materialization is possible. It is when there is such partial awakening that one enjoys psychic powers. Thus, the four Vipascits experienced the states that the others had. Well, this is a rather confused passage. It's actually trying to give a basis for the normal understanding of psychic powers, that they're actually real. But what we should really understand is the usual yogic descriptions of psychic powers is a limited understanding of the nature of consciousness. It's taking consciousness as something concrete. This isn't to rule out the possibility of psychic powers, but I would prefer to leave it to the domain of science. I would take my cue from science as far as psychic powers are concerned. I read a very convincing account of some tests that were done on one Swami Rama, and he seems to be able to affect objects at a distance, although at considerable strain and effort. So these things might be possible, but they're completely irrelevant to realization. The important point in this paragraph is that there is both awakening and non-awakening. And this is the state of the spiritual practitioner, or the enlightenment practitioner. Enlightenment, realization, is something that you can come back to at any time, but it requires effort. It requires self-remembering. Rama asked, If Vipascit was an enlightened person, how could he consider himself a lion, etc.? Vipascit was experiencing everything that there was to be experienced, all the highs and lows of conditioned experience. Vasistha replied, "My description of these kings as awakened or enlightened was only a figure of speech. In fact, Vipascit was not enlightened. The four Vipascits were neither enlightened nor were they ignorant. They were swinging in between. They were spiritual practitioners. Vipascit had experienced everything there was to experience, and he was beginning to understand things, and his attention was beginning to reflect back on itself. He was beginning to practice self-inquiry. In such people, the signs of enlightenment or liberation are seen, as also the signs of ignorance and bondage." This is very important because we often think it's one thing or the other. You're ignorant, you do your spiritual practices, and then you reach enlightenment, and end of story. It isn't like this at all. And this might require a major shift in some people's beliefs. It would certainly help to get most teachers and so-called gurus into a better perspective, a perspective which doesn't have the potential for causing so much damage, psychological and emotional damage. They are half awakened. Whatever Vipascit had attained had been attained through contemplation, not because he had reached the supreme state. All these siddhis or psychic powers are had by such contemplation.